So let's create a new integration service, and this integration service is going to be called GetID Enterprise Service. And let's go ahead and, before we even implement it, let's drag and drop this reusable service that we just created, this integration service, into this diagram. And let's wire it up. When the user clicks the next button on the first screen, it's going to call this reusable service, this GetID Enterprise Service. And once we've gotten the unique ID, we're going to traverse or navigate to the second screen, which will actually use that unique ID. Let's implement this service, and I'll use a simple implementation here. We could, of course, call out to a web service, go discover a web service or find a web service, and then make it very easy to call it and get the results back. We could implement a Java integration. In our case, I'm going to use a simple server script as a placeholder for really any integration. And in the simple server script, we'll call this get unique ID from backend service. And we can do anything here, really. Java code, JavaScript coding. We're going to return something from the service call. So let's create an output variable, and we'll call that unique ID. That's what the service call is going to return back. So let's code anything we like here. We'll keep it simple at first. You can see that as I type, there's a namespace for the local system called TW, which has its heritage in the previous name of the product, TeamWorks. As I type dot, I have code assist that gives me access to a variety of useful data and system calls. We'll use local to get access to the local variables. There's that unique ID variable that I just created, so it sees that in the code assist. And we'll set it right now for testing purposes to a hard-coded value of 1, 2, 3. So let's go ahead and wire this up so that we have a clean navigation into and out of this service. And we'll go back to where it was called from and make sure that we're mapping the data that it returns, the output mapping of this unique ID that's coming back from the service, into the process data where we need it to be. So let's use this variable picker icon, this button, to look at a listing of the process data, and we can just pick any process data. In our case here, we'll pick the ID. Let's run it to see if it's working as designed. When we get to the first screen, we'll next to the second screen, and we can see that it's populated it with that unique ID that was returned from our service call that was hard-coded. So let's make sure that it's really working and it's dynamically changeable. We'll change this to 456, save it, and run it again, and see that when we get to the screen, it's populated with 456. Let's make it a little bit more interesting. Let's drill down into this reusable service, and let's make it more of a dynamic call. One of the things we can access is system functions and data. So let's make a system call out to one of the system function calls called current process instance ID. So that will retrieve the current process instance ID of the process instance that this is running in. So now that we've coded it to return the current process instance ID, it makes logical sense to go up to the process level and run an instance of this process. So let's run the process. Let's step through this activity. Once we run this activity as TW_admin, we can step through this screen, and now we can see that it's indeed grabbing, it's calling out and retrieving the current process instance ID. We can see that in our list of currently running instances. The one on the top is the one we're running right now. We have validation that it's grabbing that instance ID 1435. So now let's implement this second activity with the activity wizard. And the primary motivation for doing this is so that we can control whether we accept or reject this request. So let's name this screen Review and Approve. In the Review and Approve screen, we can see that it's already populated a variety of data. Let's drag this Approve checkbox out of this head count request section. And the main reason I'm doing that is so that we can, in one easy step, make this head count request set of information review only, because we just need to review it in order to make a decision about approving it at this point. Let's change the visibility to disabled read-only access and see what that looks like when we run it. So let's run just this activities implementation, which is a human service UI. We'll run this UI and see what it looks like. We can see that the fields are kind of grayed out, and it looks like what we want it to look like. And we have an approve checkbox that we can leverage. So now let's go ahead and run that in the context of the process after we configure the decision gateway. This yes branch is going to be taken when certain process data, namely the approved process variable, is equal to true when the checkbox is checked. So once we've configured that, when we run the process, we ought to be able to step through it, provide some data for, let's say, drama reasons or fidelity reasons. To make this a little bit more realistic, we'll choose a date, we'll enter in an amount, $125,000 for a particular new position. This is a very important project, that's why we need the person or the position. And now the process proceeds to the second step, the review headcount request. Let's just, for variety's sake, go into the process portal, log on as TW_user. We could log on as TW_admin, either way. And we'll go ahead and work with this instance and see that it's sitting at the review headcount request step as we expect. We can change this from all tasks to from open tasks to all tasks to see an audit trail of what's happened so far. The requester entered the request headcount, and now we're sitting at the reviewer step to review the headcount request. And now we can see the read-only view of the data. We have an approval checkbox. If we hit OK without checking the approve checkbox, what should happen is that it'll go back to the first step. But actually, this reviewer notices that that request is for $125,000. In this example, you must make the budget under $100K. Otherwise, we'll need higher level approval. So we can use the built-in collaboration feature of the process portal to add a comment. And we'll go ahead and not check the approve checkbox and see that it proceeds back to the first step. It loops back the no branch to the first activity, where we, as a requester, can do several things, like, for instance, review this comment in the process portal. Now that we have insight into how we might need to adjust it and why it was rejected, there was additional documentation requested. So we can use the built-in add document attachment capability and add a document, which is some justification research. See that now we have a document in there, and we'll add a comment as a reply. I provided some documentation, and we'll keep the budget under control. So now we can see that when we submit this request and change the budget to under $100,000, which is how the game is being played currently, the approver can now claim this activity, review the contents, which include a budget of under $100,000. They could also review the comments as a collaborative exchange. Now, when we approve this, we can see the process proceeds. And if we refresh with F5, we can see that the process instance is actually completed. So now at this stage of the game, we're going to take another snapshot and call this version 3, added UI and approval logic. So now we have another snapshot. We can see it's progressed from 2 activities in a single swim lane to 3 activities in 3 swim lanes to now an activity UI implementation. If we switch from version 3 with that activity human service open, we can see in version 2 that that didn't exist. It's missing in version 2, but in version 3 it did exist. And we can do a similar thing with the screens. If we selected different versions while the UI screen builder was open, which is in this coaches tab, that's where we see the UI, then we would see the UI change immediately as we click through different versions. So now let's go ahead and go into the headcount request activity, and let's change how we use this reusable service, this integration service. Let's get rid of it from the activity level, and let's move it to the process level. This is just a simple example of how we can now, because we implemented this as an integration service, we can use it anywhere. Indeed, we could, as you'll see in a future tutorial demo, we could move this into a toolkit and actually use it across process applications, making it truly a widely reusable service. In our cases here, it's good enough to move it from the activity level to the process level to make the point that we can really call this from anywhere. So now if we call that reusable service to get unique ID before we get to that first activity, what should happen is that it will populate the process data. It'll set the process data variable ID to unique ID that is the process instance ID. Let's make sure we keep that data mapping under control. In the data mapping section of the property sheet for this service call, we're going to configure the data mapping, in other words, what comes back from the service up to the process level in the data mapping section, to be what we need it to be, which is mapped to the ID in the process data model. So let's run this elaboration on the process. We can see that the service gets called first. Because we because we did this very quickly, we got lucky, and the process diagram at this stage shows us that it was visited with this yellow highlight. That won't always happen, but sometimes it will, depending upon the speed of your machine. It's in a system lane, so we don't need to actually take any manual intervention. You'll see that as soon as we refresh this view, that it is actually proceeded without any manual intervention because it was a system activity that made a call to that service. The first activity that requires manual intervention is this head count request. If we go ahead and claim that activity or run it, we can see that it did indeed make a call out to grab that unique process instance ID, 1437. And if we fill out this sheet and follow through with this example, we can see that the process now proceeds as expected. So let's go ahead and improve this. We can see that once it's approved, the process is completed. And we get an audit trail of what was done. So now in here, let's version this final iteration. We'll call this version 4 complete. And as well as the service, we move the service. So we were done with the scenario, and we showcase some service reuse, moving that service from the activity level up to the high-level process, business process definition level. So now let's have some fun with these versions and tell the story of how this process evolved and run it along the way. So in the first version, we had just 2 activities and 1 swim lane. And as I mentioned before, when you select a version, since we're pointing at the centralized repository or shared model that's stored in the quote-unquote process center, the process center server is a part of the Lombardi engine, and that provides shared access to our single version of the truth, the shared process model. We can just click on the version number and immediately have access to not only viewing it, but running it. So if we run this, we can see what it ran and looked like back at version 1. Immediate access to all version snapshots. Now in version 2, we can see in version 2 that the process model changed to 3 activities and 3 swim lanes. If we click on the select the decision gateway, we can see in version 2 it didn't have any logic in the decision gateway. But in version 3 we did add logic, and you can see that change here dynamically in our view of the snapshot versions. In version 3, head count request included that reusable service, get ID, enterprise service. In version 4, we moved it out of this activity, so now it's gone, and moved it up to the high-level process. So with snapshots, you make it very easy to control change, to document change, to easily access any of those versions and run them if needed. And most importantly, tell the story. Imagine an executive comes in, or high-level manager comes in at the end of the day after you've been building this dynamically and running it frequently and reviewing it with the business and IT stakeholders. And they want to understand what you did today. They want to understand how the process has evolved. We can use these snapshots to walk through and tell the story and even run different versions of the process over the course of time, each day, each week, each month. And then, of course, there's the core value of the fact that we've versioned it. So that essentially is the bulk of the build from scratch scenario. I do want to make the point that these versions are revertible. So in other words, if I want to go back to where I was in version 1 and make changes to it, I could select version 1, revert it, and then it would actually change the tip or the current version of the app to that version, and then I could make changes to it. It's very right-sized for drop-dead simple version control. I hope you've enjoyed the build from scratch scenario.